Carl Panzram was perhaps one of the most spiteful humans to have walked this earth. Throughout his life, he would perform some of the most heinous crimes imaginable, turning him into one of America's most well-known serial killers. He was never motivated by lust or power, but what drove him to kill was merely his unyielding hatred towards mankind. Panzram was no ordinary criminal. He was in its purest form the embodiment of rage and vengeance. Carl Panzram was born in Polk County, Minnesota in 1891. As a child, he had an extensive record of petty crimes and was forced to attend juvenile reform school in order to curb his hostile behavior. At school, he was often physically abused due to his poor academic performance, but soon enough, Carl grew embittered and took revenge on his teachers by setting fire to the school workshop. After being expelled, Carl decided to run away for good so he could avoid any more punishments from his equally abusive family. He managed to stow away in a freight train leaving Minnesota. However, Carl's trip to the unknown was about to take a turn for the worse. As Carl was getting accustomed to his new life, he somehow met a violent group of hobos who would gang rape him while he hopped between trains across the United States. In his own words, the ordeal was so devastating that it managed to fuel him with more rage than ever. Since then, Carl would go on several crime sprees across the Midwest, terrorizing nearly everyone he encountered and burning down every establishment he stole from. He would be incarcerated multiple times and always found himself subjected to the same torture that he was quite familiar with as a child. His relationship with the system was utterly self-defeating. The more hostile he grew, the more severe his punishments turned out to be. The constant harm he had brought to himself became the very catalyst for his own anger. But when this dreadful cycle persisted, his unbridled rage eventually culminated into pure misanthropy. He hated everyone, including himself. As a young man, Panzram began to develop a taste for sodomizing the people he robbed. He wasn't necessarily a homosexual, but he did commit rape in order to assert his warped dominance over most of his male victims. After being arrested yet again in 1915, Panzram was sent to Oregon State Penitentiary, one of the most brutal correctional facilities in America. Unwilling to serve his time, he soon escaped with a fellow inmate and ran off to the East Coast, where he committed some of the most iconic crimes throughout his life. Once Panzram fled to New York, he somehow got his hands on a seaman's identification card, giving him the chance to go on a crime spree spanning multiple countries without allaying suspicion to himself. He reached places like Panama, the UK, and even Chile, where he claims to have set an oil rig on fire for no reason. He would also rape and terrorize as much men as he could during his expeditions. But once he returned, Panzram decided to take his twisted little game to a whole new level. On the summer of 1920, Panzram broke inside the home of President William Taft in New Haven, Connecticut, stealing his .45 caliber along with some jewels which he sold to acquire a new yacht. He then invited sailors around New York, promising them free alcohol on his private boat, and raped them one by one as they became intoxicated. He then shot his victims using the president's handgun and dumped their bodies near the coast of Long Island, but so far, this was only the beginning of his homicidal rage. After spending time robbing other boats near the Atlantic, Panzram was sent to prison once again for another 6 months. Upon his release, however, Panzram managed to stow away on a ship headed for Angola, where he claims to have raped and killed a local child by bashing his brains out with a rock. He then traveled up north to the Congo, where he shot 6 locals that he hired for an excursion near the river. He even bragged about feeding their bodies to crocodiles before retreating back to the US. When he returned, Panzram relished on committing more acts of mayhem to endanger as much people as he could. He had several murder fantasies, such as blowing up a railway station and poisoning an entire city's water supply with arsenic. He even considered hijacking an English warship to ignite a war between Britain and the US. Fortunately, these wicked fantasies were not entirely carried out. On September 2, 1928, Panzram was arrested for committing burglary in Washington, D.C. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in Leavenworth Penitentiary, promising to kill the first man to bother him there. In response, the warden isolated him from the rest of the inmates and had guards watch over him constantly, but this did not stop Panzram from staying true to his previous threat. After a few months of silence, Panzram managed to kill Robert Wank, an unsuspecting foreman who simply asked for his help in the prison laundry room. This showed how unabated Panzram still was in all of his attempts to defy authority. As a result, he effectively sealed his own fate and was sentenced to death a year later. Carl Panzram could never succeed in his quest to spite humanity, but he has made a strong impact nevertheless. While in death row, Panzram was befriended by Henry Lesser, a security guard who treated him with a degree of kindness he was not normally accustomed to. This man became the closest thing Panzram ever had to a friend, and soon enough, he agreed to write down his autobiography for him. It was in this autobiography where we learned more about the man, and upon closer inspection, we can safely assume that Panzram was himself a victim of society. Born to poverty, scorned by family, and abused by the system in every way possible, it is no wonder Panzram turned out the way he is. He was deprived of any form of care since day one, and the only thing he became familiar with was hate. This was the only thing he could communicate to a world that he believed was out to get him. But despite being a victim of circumstances, Carl Panzram was still a criminal to the very end. In his lifetime, he has committed 21 murders, thousands of burglaries, and performed several acts of sodomy on countless people. But for all these things, he remains not the least bit remorseful. On September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was hanged. Several human rights organizations tried to appeal on his behalf, but even they were not spared from his cries of hatred. Carl Panzram truly was the embodiment of rage and vengeance, but his life story is more than just a testimony of extreme human behavior. It is the story of a man who fought the world in an ill-fated mission to avenge himself. It is the struggle of a victim who victimized others to conceal his own victimhood. His interactions with Henry Lesser proved he had every chance to be part of normal society, and if only the penal system was geared towards rehabilitation, Carl Panzram could have been saved from his own madness.